Hello there, my wandering dreamers. Tonight, under the silver hush of a sleepless moon, we step into the shadows of new moon, the chapter where everything fades, only to be found again. A story of loss and longing, of echoes left behind, and questions that whisper through the dark. Between the heartbeat of love and the silence that follows lies a secret world waiting to be touched by dreamlight. So, before you drift away, please support us and subscribe to the channel so we can keep bringing you deeper into the twilight. Get yourself settled in. Close your eyes. Breathe in very slow. And as the stars begin their quiet watch, allow the mystery to unfold, where every shadow hides a truth, and every truth becomes a dream. Welcome to New Moon, where absence becomes devotion, and even in darkness, love remembers the light. The evening begins innocently enough, wrapped in the golden glow of September 18th, 2006, with 18 candles waiting to be lit, and a girl who wishes more than anything to remain 17 forever. Bella Swan stands in the Cullen house, that pristine sanctuary of glass and light, perched on the edge of the forest, surrounded by the family she has come to love, the family who loves her in return. And yet, beneath the surface of this celebration lies a tension so profound that it will shatter everything she knows, everything she believes about her place in their world. The theories surrounding this night are many, each one peeling back another layer of what truly happened, when a single drop of blood changed the course of her entire existence, revealing complexities and hidden truths that the simple narrative of the event can never fully capture. We must begin with Jasper, the newest vegetarian among the Cullens, the one whose control has always been the most fragile, the most uncertain, a vampire who carries the weight of his violent past like chains wrapped around his soul. For decades, he fed on human blood, without question, without remorse, his gift of emotional manipulation, making him one of the most dangerous vampires the South had ever known, a weapon in Maria's army of newborns, trained to kill and destroy without hesitation. And though he has spent years among the Cullens, learning their way of life, learning to resist the call of human blood, there are those who theorize that his struggle that evening began long before Bella ever cut her finger on that innocent piece of wrapping paper, that the battle for control had been raging within him from the moment she entered their home. Watch him in the moments before the accident, standing slightly apart from the others, his posture rigid, his jaw tight, his eyes holding a hunger that he fights with every fiber of his being, every muscle in his body tense with the effort of maintaining the facade of calm. Alice stands beside him, her hand in his, her presence a calming influence, her gift allowing her to see the moments ahead and guide him through the dangerous waters of this evening. But even she cannot completely ease the war that rages within him every moment he spends in Bella's presence, every breath he takes filled with the scent of her blood pumping through her veins, warm and alive and impossibly tempting. Some believe that Jasper had been struggling all evening, that the concentrated scent of Bella's blood in the enclosed space of the Cullen house had been testing his control from the moment she arrived, that every breath he took was an exercise in restraint, every second a battle against instincts that had been honed over more than a century and a half of feeding on humans, instincts that ran deeper than thought or reason, rooted in the very essence of what he was. The theory suggests that he remained with the family not out of confidence in his control, but out of a desperate desire to prove himself, to show that he could be trusted around Bella, that he could overcome the newness of his vegetarian lifestyle through sheer force of will, that he could be the brother and family member they needed him to be, rather than the monster he feared he still was beneath the surface. In this interpretation, the paper cut was not the beginning of his struggle, but rather the breaking point of a resistance that had been crumbling all evening, the final straw that shattered whatever restraint he had managed to maintain through hours of silent suffering. And when that single drop of blood appears, bright red against Bella's pale skin, it is not a surprise that breaks his control, but rather the inevitable conclusion of a battle he had been losing from the start. The theorists who support this view point to small details in the text, the way Jasper positions himself at the edge of the room, the way he speaks little during the celebration, the tension that Alice seems to sense in him, all suggesting a vampire who is barely holding on, who is one moment away from catastrophe even before the accident occurs. But there is another theory, darker and more troubling, that suggests Jasper's attack was not entirely about bloodlust at all, that his gift of emotional manipulation, which allows him to both feel and influence the emotions of those around him, had been overwhelmed by something else entirely that evening, something that goes beyond simple hunger or instinct. Consider the emotional landscape of that room in the moments before Bella opened her gift from Alice and Edward. Bella's discomfort at being the center of attention, her anxiety about growing older while Edward remains frozen at 17, her fear that she is losing time, that every day that passes takes her further from the immortal world she wishes to join, Edward's own tension and worry about her mortality, his constant awareness of how fragile she is, how easily she could be hurt or killed, his guilt at keeping her in a world that puts her in constant danger, Alice's excitement and hope for the future, her visions of Bella as one of them, her certainty that everything will work out the way it should, Rosalie's barely concealed disapproval of Bella's presence in their lives, her resentment that this human girl has access to the immortality that Rosalie herself never chose, Emmett's genuine affection mixed with concern, his protective instincts warring with his awareness of the danger, Carlyle's careful observation of the family dynamics, his worry about whether they are making the right choices, Esme's maternal warmth tinged with worry about what Bella's humanity means for Edward's happiness, her fear that her son will never find peace. All of these emotions swirling together in one space, amplified by Jasper's gift, creating a storm of feeling that he could not filter or control, each person's emotional state bleeding into his awareness until he could no longer distinguish his own feelings from theirs, no longer maintain the boundaries that keep him separate and in control. When Bella's blood begins to flow, even that single drop, Jasper does not simply react to the scent as any vampire might. He reacts to the sudden spike of emotion that accompanies it, Edward's instant terror for Bella's safety, Alice's vision of what might happen, the family's collective alarm, and his own gift turns against him in that moment, amplifying his bloodlust beyond what it might have been under normal circumstances, feeding his hunger with the fear and panic of everyone around him, creating a perfect storm of instinct and supernatural influence that makes his attack almost inevitable, nearly impossible to resist. This theory paints Jasper not as weak or lacking in control, but rather as a victim of his own gift, unable to separate his own hunger from the emotional chaos that surrounds him, drowning in a sea of feeling that pushes him past the point of reason or restraint. It suggests that his gift, which should make him more empathetic and controlled, actually makes him more vulnerable in situations of high emotion, that he absorbs the panic and fear of others and cannot help but react to it, that the attack was as much about the overwhelming emotional environment as it was about the blood itself. Then there is Alice, whose visions have guided the Cullens through countless dangers, whose ability to see the future has saved them time and time again. Who can perceive the outcome of decisions before they are even made? And yet, she does not see Bella cutting her finger on the wrapping paper, does not see the moment that will change everything, does not warn them to stop or postpone or take precautions. The theories about this failure are fascinating and numerous, each one attempting to explain why someone whose gift is so powerful, so reliable, so comprehensive in its scope, could miss something so crucial, so devastating in its consequences. The most common theories suggest that Alice's visions are limited by the nature of the decisions that lead to them, that she sees the results of choices and intentions rather than accidents or random chance, and a paper cut is neither intentional nor the result of a significant decision, merely an unfortunate accident that falls outside the scope of her gift, a moment of pure chance that no amount of precognition could anticipate. In this interpretation, Alice's gift has a blind spot when it comes to the truly random, the genuinely accidental, the moments that occur without decision or intent, and this limitation, while rare, proves catastrophic when it intersects with a situation as volatile as this birthday celebration. But some theorists go deeper, suggesting that Alice did see something that evening, perhaps not the paper cut itself, but the danger that surrounded Bella, the fragility of the situation, the tension in Jasper's control, the various futures that branched out from this gathering, some peaceful and some violent, and that she made the choice to proceed with the party anyway, believing that they could handle whatever might happen, that the risk was worth the reward of celebrating Bella's birthday as a family, of treating her as though she already belonged to their world, of giving Edward and Bella this moment of normalcy and happiness before whatever darkness lay ahead. In this interpretation, Alice's failure is not one of vision but of judgment, a miscalculation of her brother's ability to resist, a too optimistic belief in the strength of their vegetarian lifestyle, a hope that love and family bonds would be enough to overcome instinct and hunger. There is even a darker theory, one that some find difficult to accept, but that aligns with certain aspects of Alice's character, that she saw the attack coming and allowed it to happen, that she understood on some level that this incident would force Edward to confront the danger that Bella faced by being with their family, that it would push him toward a decision he had been avoiding, that sometimes the future requires a catalyst to unfold in the way it must, and that Alice, with her absolute faith in her visions and her willingness to manipulate events to achieve the outcome she believes are best, made the calculated choice to let the party proceed knowing what would happen. This theory is harder to accept, painting Alice as manipulative rather than merely mistaken, as someone who would sacrifice Bella's immediate safety for what she perceived as a greater good or a necessary future. But it aligns with her character's tendency to push people toward the futures she believes are best for them. Her willingness to withhold information or shade the truth if she believes the outcome will be worth the temporary pain. And what of Edward himself, whose reaction to the attack is so extreme, so immediate, so violent in its protective intensity that it causes more harm than it prevents? He throws Bella across the room to protect her from Jasper, sending her crashing into a table covered with glass and crystal, causing far more damage than the original paper cut ever did, transforming a minor injury into a scene of blood and broken glass and real danger. And in the aftermath, as Carlyle calmly stitches her wounds, his experienced hands moving with precision and care, Edward stands apart, his expression not just concerned but devastated, as though he has just witnessed the confirmation of his worst fears, as though everything he has been dreading has finally come to pass. The theory here is perhaps the most painful to consider, the one that casts the longest shadow over everything that follows. That Edward had already been contemplating leaving Bella before this incident ever occurred. That he had been looking for a reason, an excuse, a clear sign that he should remove himself and his family from her life before something terrible happened, before his presence led to her death. Throughout the summer, he had watched her sleep, had read the minds of everyone around her, had seen the constant danger she faced simply by being associated with his family, the threats from nomadic vampires, the risk of exposure, the possibility that one day his control or his family's control might slip at exactly the wrong moment. And perhaps he had been building toward this decision for weeks or even months, held back only by his love for her, by his selfish desire to keep her in his life despite the risks, by his inability to imagine an existence without her. The birthday party attack in this theory was not the cause of his decision to leave, but rather the justification he needed, the concrete evidence that allowed him to do what some part of him had been planning all along, the proof that his fears were not paranoia, but reality, that Bella would never be safe with him, no matter how much they loved each other. When he looks at her bleeding on the floor, surrounded by shattered glass and crystal, her arm torn and bleeding from injuries he caused in his attempt to protect her, he does not just see the immediate danger, but the inevitable future, all the ways she could be hurt or killed because of him, every possible scenario in which his world destroys her. And he seizes upon this moment as the catalyst for a departure that had been taking shape in his heart for longer than he would ever admit, even to himself. The forest scene that follows the birthday party disaster has become one of the most analyzed moments in the entire Twilight saga. A conversation wrapped in lies and half-truths, words chosen with surgical precision to inflict maximum damage while supposedly protecting the person they wound. Edward leads Bella into the woods behind her house on a grey September afternoon, the trees closing around them like witnesses to something terrible and inevitable. and what he tells her in those moments will haunt both of them for months to come, echoing through every decision they make, every path they choose, every moment of pain they endure in the darkness that follows. "I don't want you," he says, and these 4 words become the foundation of the deepest theory surrounding his departure, the cruelest lie he could possibly tell, chosen specifically because he knows it will accomplish what he needs it to accomplish, that it will drive her away more effectively than any other explanation he could offer. The theory suggests that Edward, who has spent months inside Bella's mind through her dreams, who has listened to her every word and observed her every gesture, who understands her insecurities and fears better than anyone else in her life, knows exactly which words will hurt her most profoundly, which phrase will make her believe that everything between them was based on a misunderstanding, that she was always alone in the depth of her feelings, that his love was never as real or as absolute as hers. He does not say he is leaving to protect her, does not explain that he fears for her safety, does not tell her the truth that might allow her to argue or negotiate or find some compromise that would let them stay together. Instead, he attacks the very foundation of her self-worth, implies that she was a temporary diversion, an interesting curiosity that has run its course. And some theorists believe this choice reveals not just his strategy, but his psychology, his deep-seated belief that he is not worthy of love, that anyone who truly knew him would recoil in horror, and so he projects this belief onto Bella, tells her that she is the one who is not enough, transfers his own self-loathing onto her in a moment of emotional violence that will scar them both. The forest scene itself is carefully constructed, every element chosen to reinforce the finality of his decision, and theories abound about what Edward was truly thinking during this conversation, what was happening behind the mask of cold indifference he shows to Bella. His face is described as empty, devoid of emotion, a blank slate that gives her nothing to hold on to, no crack in the facade that might reveal his true feelings. And yet we know from later books that this composure cost him everything, that maintaining this pretense of indifference while his heart was breaking required every ounce of his self-control, every bit of his centuries of practice at concealing his emotions. Some theorists suggest that Edward was in a dissociative state during this conversation, that he had to separate himself from his feelings so completely in order to say these words, that he almost became another person, a version of himself capable of cruelty that the real Edward could never achieve. In this interpretation, the emptiness Bella sees in his face is not an act, but a genuine disconnection, a psychological defense mechanism that allowed him to function while doing something that went against every instinct he possessed, every desire of his heart. The theory proposes that Edward had rehearsed these words, practiced this scene in his mind dozens or hundreds of times before actually speaking them, preparing himself for the moment when he would have to destroy Bella's faith in his love in order to set her free. His true motivations for leaving extend far beyond the simple explanation he offers, far beyond the birthday party attack that serves as the catalyst, and the theories exploring these deeper reasons paint a portrait of a vampire torn apart by conflicting obligations and impossible choices. There is the obvious motivation of protecting Bella from physical danger, the fear that another incident like the party will occur, and next time no one will be able to stop it, that Jasper or another member of his family will kill her before anyone can intervene, and this fear is real and justified, grounded in the concrete evidence of what nearly happened. But beneath this surface reason lie layers of more complex motivations that Edward himself might not fully understand or acknowledge. There is his fear of his own nature, the terror that lives in every moment he spends with Bella, the constant awareness that he is a predator spending time with prey, that his love for her does not change what he is or eliminate the danger he represents. Edward has never fully accepted his vampire nature, has always seen himself as a monster despite his vegetarian lifestyle, despite his soul and his capacity for love. And being with Bella forces him to confront this self-loathing every single day, to acknowledge that he is putting the person he loves most in danger simply by existing in her life. The theory suggests that Edward's rebellion period, those years when he left Carlisle and fed on humans, choosing murderers and criminals as his victims but feeding nonetheless, left scars on his psyche that never fully healed, that he has never forgiven himself for those years or truly believed that he is different from other vampires, better than the monsters who hunt without conscience or care. Some theorists propose that Edward's decision to leave was influenced by a deep-seated belief that Bella deserves a normal human life, a future filled with the experiences he can never give her, children and aging and the full spectrum of human existence, and that his love for her demanded that he remove himself from her life before she sacrificed too much for him, before she gave up her humanity and her future for a love that he believed was selfish on his part. In this interpretation, Edward sees himself as a temptation that Bella must be protected from, not just physically, but existentially, that his presence in her life is leading her down a path that will result in the loss of everything that makes her human, and he cannot bear the responsibility of that transformation. There is also the theory that Edward was responding to pressure from his family, that the birthday party incident revealed tensions and concerns that had been building for months, that Rosalie's disapproval and worry about exposure, Jasper's struggle with control, even Carlisle's quiet concern about the sustainability of their situation, all weighed on Edward's decision. The theory suggests that while the Cullens would never have directly demanded that Edward leave Bella, their unspoken thoughts and concerns, which Edward heard constantly through his gift, created an environment where he felt he had no choice, where staying with Bella meant putting not just her, but his entire family at risk of discovery or violence. Every thought from Rosalie about the danger of exposure, every moment of Jasper's struggle that Edward witnessed through his brother's mind, every flash of concern from Carlisle or Esme about where this relationship was heading, all accumulated into an unbearable weight that pushed Edward toward the decision to leave. The Cullen family's exit from Forks is executed with military precision, every trace of their presence erased as though they had never existed at all, and theories about how planned this departure was range from spontaneous to meticulously orchestrated over weeks or months. The speed with which they leave, vanishing within days of the birthday party, suggests some level of preparation, some contingency plan that was already in place waiting to be activated. And this raises questions about how long the family had been discussing the possibility of leaving, how many conversations had taken place outside of Edward's presence about the danger Bella represented to their security and lifestyle. Some believe that Carlisle, with his centuries of experience and his role as family leader, had been preparing for this possibility from the moment Edward first showed serious interest in Bella, that he understood better than his children the impossibility of maintaining a long-term relationship between a vampire and a human without either transformation or tragedy, and that he had quietly made arrangements for a swift departure should it become necessary. In this theory, Carlyle's lack of a personal goodbye to Bella was not coldness, but rather an acknowledgement that he was complicit in the decision to leave, that he had perhaps even encouraged Edward toward this choice, believing in his wisdom that separation was the only way to keep Bella safe and allow her to return to a normal human life. The theory proposes that Carlyle, who had lived through countless decades and witnessed the consequences of vampire-human relationships throughout history, knew that these connections almost always ended in transformation or death, and he wanted to spare both Edward and Bella that inevitable conclusion. Alice's goodbye becomes a subject of intense theoretical scrutiny because she alone among the Cullens is allowed to say farewell to Bella, and the question of why Edward permitted this while forbidding all other contact suggests complex motivations and calculations. The most straightforward theory is that Edward knew Alice would find a way to say goodbye, regardless of what he demanded, that her visions would allow her to evade any restrictions he tried to place, and so he chose to allow it on his terms, rather than have her defy him. But there are deeper possibilities that some theorists explore, including the idea that Edward wanted Alice to say goodbye because he knew she would maintain some connection to Bella through her visions, that even if he could not be with Bella, even if he had to leave her completely, Alice's gift would ensure that someone was watching over her, seeing if she was in danger, able to intervene if necessary. The theory that Edward's self-deception runs throughout his decision to leave, that he genuinely believed Bella would move on and forget him, find a normal human boy, and live a happy human life, represents perhaps the most psychologically complex interpretation of his motivations. How could someone as intelligent as Edward, someone who had witnessed Bella's depth of feeling, who had seen her willingness to sacrifice everything for him, truly believe that she would simply forget and move on as though their love had never existed? The theorists who explore this question suggest that Edward needed to believe this lie in order to leave at all, that he could not have walked away if he had allowed himself to acknowledge the pain he was causing, the devastation that his departure would create in Bella's life. In this interpretation, Edward's mind constructed an elaborate fantasy in which Bella would grieve briefly and then recover, would eventually see his departure as a blessing that allowed her to return to her normal life, would even thank him someday for making the hard choice that she could not make herself. This fantasy was necessary for Edward to function, to put one foot in front of the other and leave forks, to maintain his resolve in the months that followed, even as part of him must have known it was a lie, must have understood that Bella's love was as deep and as permanent as his own. The self-deception becomes a survival mechanism, a way for Edward to live with a decision that would otherwise destroy him, and the theory suggests that maintaining this lie required constant effort, constant reinforcement, a deliberate blindness to any evidence that contradicted his chosen narrative. The cruelty of his words to her in the forest then becomes not just a strategy to make her let go, but also a form of self-punishment, a way of ensuring that he would not weaken and return, that he would not allow himself to take back the words or soften the blow. By making the break as brutal and final as possible, by destroying her faith in his love, Edward was also destroying any possibility of reconciliation, burning the bridges behind him so thoroughly that there could be no going back even if his resolve faltered. This theory paints Edward as someone who understood his own weaknesses, who knew that if he left any opening, any possibility of return, he would eventually take it regardless of the danger, and so he made the separation as absolute and as painful as possible to protect both of them from his inability to stay away. Rosalie's influence on the decision to leave is another rich source of theory and speculation, as we know from later books that she has always harbored concerns about Bella's presence in their lives, always worried about the risk of exposure, the danger to their family's carefully maintained secrecy. Some theorists propose that Rosalie was the voice in Edward's head that he could not ignore, the family member whose thoughts most reinforced his own fears and doubts, whose perspective on the danger Bella represented gave him permission to do what part of him wanted to do anyway. Rosalie's thoughts, constantly accessible to Edward through his gift, would have been a drumbeat of concern and disapproval, a reminder of all the ways that Bella's humanity threatened their existence. And Edward, already inclined toward leaving, found in Rosalie's perspective the justification he needed. But there is a more nuanced theory that suggests Rosalie's opposition to Bella was actually protective rather than hostile, that she saw in Bella's situation a mirror of her own past, a young woman being pulled into the vampire world without fully understanding what she would lose, and that her resistance came from a desire to save Bella from the fate that Rosalie herself had endured, the transformation she never chose and has never fully accepted. In this interpretation, Rosalie's influence on Edward's decision was not malicious, but rather born from her own trauma and regret, her belief that no one should become a vampire unless they truly understand the price they are paying, the loss of warmth and sleep and children, and the simple human experiences that can never be recovered once they are gone. The treaty with the Quileutes becomes relevant to the Cullens' departure in ways that are often overlooked, as their presence in Forks had always been contingent on maintaining the terms of that agreement, and the theories suggest that the increased werewolf activity that would soon begin was already on Edward's mind, already part of his calculation about whether it was safe to remain in the area. The pages of New Moon that follow Edward's departure are famously blank, marked only by the names of months passing in stark simplicity: October, November, December, January. Each one a void where Bella's life should be, where experiences and memories and growth should fill the space. But instead, there is only emptiness, only the passage of time marked by nothing but survival. These missing months have become one of the most theorized aspects of the entire saga, a gap in the narrative that invites speculation about what truly happened during Bella's descent into Catatonia, what she experienced in those long nights and longer days, what supernatural forces might have been at work beneath the surface of her psychological collapse, and what these blank pages reveal about the nature of love and loss when vampires and humans intertwine their lives and hearts in ways that defy the natural order of existence. The theories about these time gaps begin with the most basic question: what actually happened during those 4 months that Stephen E. Meyer chose not to write? not to describe, not to give us access to through Bella's narration. The literal blank pages in the book represent something more than just authorial choice or narrative efficiency. They represent a period so dark, so devoid of meaning or hope, that even Bella herself in retrospect cannot or will not examine them closely, cannot bear to put into words what those months felt like from the inside, what it meant to exist in a state of such profound emptiness that memory itself seems to have rejected the experience as too painful to preserve. Some theorists suggest that Bella's memory of this period is genuinely fragmented, that trauma created gaps in her ability to recall specific events or experiences, that she moved through those months in a dissociative state where she was present physically but absent mentally, her consciousness retreating to some protected space deep inside where the pain could not quite reach her, where she could exist in a kind of hibernation until the worst of the grief had passed. Others propose that the blank pages represent not absence of experience, but rather repetition so complete that there was nothing new to record, that every day was exactly like the one before, a cycle of waking and going through motions and sleeping and nightmares and waking again, and that this repetitive emptiness could not be captured in narrative form, because narrative requires change, requires progression, requires something to happen. And nothing happened during those months except the slow passage of time and the constant ache of loss. In this interpretation, Bella was not catatonic in the medical sense, but rather caught in a loop of depression so profound that her life became a series of identical days, each one as grey and meaningless as the last, each morning bringing only the realization that she had to survive another 24 hours without purpose or hope or connection to anything that mattered, each night bringing the relief of unconsciousness followed by the torment of nightmares that made sleep itself a kind of torture rather than a refuge from her waking emptiness. Charlie's helplessness during this period becomes a subject of deep theoretical analysis as we see through Bella's later recollections that her father watched her deteriorate with growing alarm, but seemed unable or unwilling to intervene in meaningful ways beyond suggesting that perhaps she should spend time with friends, or consider calling her mother, or think about getting out of the house more often. Gentle suggestions that Bella ignored or deflected, with the mechanical efficiency of someone who has learned to perform normalcy without actually feeling it. The theories about Charlie's response range from sympathetic to critical, exploring what he truly understood about Bella's condition, what resources he considered or rejected, what calculations he made about how to help his daughter through this crisis without overstepping the boundaries he had always maintained in their relationship. Some theorists paint Charlie as a man doing his best with limited emotional tools, a father from a generation and a culture that doesn't easily discuss feelings or seek psychological help, trying to support Bella in the only ways he knows how, through physical presence and concerned observation, and the hope that time will heal what he cannot fix, that love and stability and routine will eventually bring his daughter back to herself without the need for outside intervention or uncomfortable conversations about emotions. But there are darker theories that suggest Charlie understood more than he let on, that he suspected Bella's relationship with Edward had been unhealthy or dangerous in ways he could not articulate, perhaps even suspecting that Edward had some kind of inappropriate control over Bella, Some hold on her emotions that went beyond normal teenage romance, some quality to their relationship that had set off alarm bells in Charlie's law enforcement instincts, even if he could not identify exactly what was wrong. In this interpretation, some part of him believed this separation, however painful, was ultimately for the best, that Bella needed to break free from whatever hold Edward had on her and return to being the daughter Charlie remembered from before the Cullens came to Forks, the girl who was independent and pragmatic and grounded in reality. Charlie's failure to seek professional help for Bella's obvious depression was not ignorance, but rather a calculated decision to let her work through this grief on her own, to avoid validating or intensifying her feelings by treating them as something that required medical intervention, believing perhaps that acknowledging the depth of her pain would somehow make it more real, more permanent, more difficult to overcome, that by treating it as a normal breakup rather than a psychological crisis, he was helping her maintain perspective and avoid becoming dependent on therapy or medication. The question of what Charlie truly understood about the supernatural elements of Bella's life during this period generates fascinating speculation, as there are hints throughout the series that Charlie is more perceptive than he appears, that he chooses not to ask questions whose answers might disturb the careful equilibrium he maintains, that he practices a kind of willful ignorance that allows him to function as a father and a police chief without having to confront truths that would shatter his understanding of reality. Did Charlie suspect that the Cullens were not quite human? That there was something fundamentally different about them that explained their sudden departure and Bella's devastated response? Something that went beyond the usual quirks of wealthy private people. The theories suggest that Charlie, with his law enforcement training and his years of observing human behavior, must have noticed the Cullens' peculiarities, their inhuman beauty and stillness, their absence from school on sunny days, the way they moved and spoke and existed in the world. The fact that Dr. Cullen never seemed to age despite having supposedly lived in Forks for years, the way the family kept to themselves and never quite integrated into the community despite their surface friendliness and Carlisle's respected position at the hospital. Some theorists propose that Charlie conducted his own quiet investigation into the Cullens after their departure, perhaps checking records or making inquiries about their history, their previous locations, the trail of their existence through various towns and cities, and that what he found or failed to find disturbed him enough that he was relieved they were gone, that he saw their absence as removing a threat he could not define or defend against through normal law enforcement channels. In this interpretation, Charlie's concern about Bella's depression was mixed with relief that she was no longer involved with Edward, that whatever danger the Cullens represented had moved on, and his strategy of waiting out her grief was based on the belief that time and distance would eventually allow her to see that the relationship had been unhealthy, that she had escaped something that could have destroyed her in ways far worse than a broken heart. Bella's nightmares during this period are described in fragments and hints, terrible dreams that wake her screaming night after night, dreams so vivid and terrifying that Charlie comes running to her room expecting to find an intruder or an emergency, only to discover his daughter thrashing in her bed, crying out for Edward in her sleep, reliving some horror that she can never quite articulate when she wakes, that dissolves into fragments the moment consciousness returns, leaving only the echo of terror and loss. The theories about these dreams explore whether they were simply psychological manifestations of her grief and trauma, or whether something more supernatural was occurring, whether the boundary between Bella's sleeping mind and the larger supernatural world had become permeable in ways that neither she nor Edward understood or anticipated. The most common theory suggests that the dreams were Bella's subconscious mind processing the loss of Edward, working through the trauma of abandonment and the destruction of her future as she had imagined it, replaying the forest scene and the birthday party and all the moments they had shared, twisting them into nightmares where Edward's true nature was revealed as monstrous, where his love was exposed as false, where she was left alone in darkness with no hope of rescue or redemption or return to happiness, her mind torturing itself with endless variations on the theme of loss and abandonment. But there are more intriguing theories that propose Bella's dreams during this period were not entirely generated by her own mind, that the bond between her and Edward, forged through months of intimacy and his constant presence in her thoughts, created a connection that persisted even across the distance of their separation, a thread of consciousness that linked them regardless of miles or continents or Edward's intention to sever all ties. In this interpretation, Bella's nightmares were actually psychic echoes of Edward's own torment, her mind unconsciously reaching for him across the miles and encountering his anguish, his self-loathing, his desperate loneliness, and translating these emotions into the nightmares that plagued her sleep. The theory suggests that vampire bonds, particularly those involving someone with Bella's later revealed mental gifts, might create connections that transcend physical proximity, that thoughts and feelings could bleed between bonded individuals even when they are separated by continents and oceans, that the very act of Edward trying to forget Bella created ripples in whatever supernatural connection linked them. Ripples that manifested in her sleeping mind as nightmares of loss and abandonment. Some theorists take this idea even further, proposing that Bella's nightmares were actually a form of astral projection or psychic wandering, that her sleeping mind literally traveled to wherever Edward was, following the thread of their connection like Ariadne's string through a labyrinth, and that what she experienced in those dreams was not symbolic but actual, that she was somehow present with him in his suffering, observing his misery even if neither of them consciously understood what was happening, even if both would have denied the possibility of such a connection. This theory would explain the visceral quality of her nightmares, the way they felt more real than normal dreams, more immediate and overwhelming, because they were not fabrications of her imagination, but rather genuine experiences filtered through the strange lens of psychic connection, her consciousness touching his across the void and recoiling from the pain it found there, from the depth of his self-inflicted torment and the violence of his grief that matched and perhaps even exceeded her own. The zombie period that follows the most acute phase of Bella's grief, where she begins to function again, but without any real presence or engagement with life, where she returns to school and completes her homework and helps Charlie with dinner, but does so with the mechanical efficiency of a robot executing its programming, represents another rich area of theoretical exploration. Charlie describes her as being physically present but emotionally absent, going through the motions of living without actually participating in her own existence. And the theories analyze this state from both medical and supernatural perspectives, attempting to understand whether what Bella experienced was purely human suffering, or whether her connection to the vampire world had altered her in ways that made her grief something more than ordinary heartbreak. From a purely psychological standpoint, Bella's behavior is consistent with severe clinical depression, the kind that requires professional intervention and possibly medication, where the ability to feel pleasure or connection or hope is completely suppressed, where existence becomes a matter of pure mechanical routine divorced from any emotional content, where the person continues to function but has lost access to the feelings and desires that make life worth living, that give meaning to the daily activities that fill our hours. But some theorists propose that Bella's zombie state was influenced by supernatural factors beyond simple depression, that the sudden severing of her connection to Edward, the vampire she had come to love and depend on, created a wound that was not entirely psychological but also metaphysical in nature, a tear in the fabric of her being that could not heal through normal means or through the passage of time alone. The moment when Bella first hears Edward's voice again marks a turning point in her descent, a discovery that will shape everything that follows and lead her down paths of recklessness that blur the line between self-preservation and self-destruction. It happens almost by accident, this first auditory hallucination, when she approaches a group of men outside a bar in Port Angeles, men who remind her viscerally of the night Edward saved her from assault. And as danger crystallizes around her, as the threat becomes real and immediate, Edward's voice cuts through her consciousness with perfect clarity, velvet and furious and protective, commanding her to turn around and walk away, to remove herself from danger immediately. The theories surrounding these hallucinations explore whether they were truly products of Bella's traumatized mind, or whether something more supernatural was occurring, whether Edward's voice was a psychological coping mechanism or evidence of a bond that transcended the physical separation he had tried so desperately to create. The most straightforward psychological theory suggests that Bella's mind, desperate for any connection to Edward, created these auditory hallucinations as a way of keeping him present in her life, that her subconscious manufactured his voice in moments of danger because she associated him so strongly with protection and safety, because he had always been the one to rescue her from threats she could not handle alone. In this interpretation, the hallucinations were a symptom of her unresolved grief and her inability to accept his absence, her mind refusing to let go, even as her conscious self tried to move forward, creating a version of Edward that could still watch over her and keep her safe even if the real Edward was thousands of miles away and determined never to return. The voice served as both comfort and torment, a reminder of what she had lost, but also a lifeline to something that felt like connection, however illusory, a way for her traumatized psyche to cope with abandonment by refusing to accept that the abandonment was complete or final. But there are more intriguing theories that propose these auditory experiences were not hallucinations at all, but rather genuine supernatural phenomena, evidence that the bond between Bella and Edward had created a connection that persisted despite distance and intention, that her ability to hear his voice was not imagination, but a form of psychic communication that operated beyond the normal boundaries of space and conscious will. Some theorists suggest that Edward, despite his resolve to stay away, was somehow unconsciously monitoring Bella through their bond, that his consciousness reached out to her in moments of extreme danger, warning her away from threats even though he believed he had severed all connection between them. In this interpretation, the voice Bella heard was not a fabrication of her own mind, but Edward's actual thoughts, breaking through whatever barriers separated them, his protective instincts overriding his determination to leave her alone, his love proving stronger than his resolve, demonstrating that the connection between them was not something that could be severed by distance or intention, but rather something fundamental and unbreakable. The question of why Edward's voice appeared specifically in moments of danger rather than in everyday situations becomes crucial to understanding the nature of these experiences, a puzzle that theorists have explored from multiple angles with varying degrees of success. If they were purely psychological hallucinations, we might expect Bella to hear Edward's voice constantly, in quiet moments as well as dangerous ones, her mind seeking comfort and connection whenever possible, manufacturing his presence during lonely evenings or difficult days at school when she felt most isolated and bereft. But the voice appears only when she's engaged in reckless behavior, only when adrenaline floods her system and danger becomes imminent, suggesting that there is something specific about these heightened states that triggers the phenomenon, some condition that must be met before the voice can manifest, some threshold that must be crossed before the barrier between his consciousness and hers becomes permeable enough for communication. Some theorists propose that adrenaline acts as a kind of supernatural amplifier, that the biochemical changes in Bella's body during moments of danger create conditions where psychic connections become possible, where the veil between minds becomes thin enough for thoughts to pass through, where the normal barriers that separate one consciousness from another temporarily dissolve under the influence of extreme physiological stress. In this framework, Bella's fear and the accompanying rush of adrenaline function like a radio tuner, adjusting her consciousness to a frequency where Edward's thoughts or presence can reach her, where the bond between them becomes strong enough to manifest as audible words rather than merely emotional impressions or vague sensations. The theory suggests that all humans might have latent psychic abilities that are suppressed by the normal functioning of the brain, and that extreme stress temporarily disrupts that suppression, allowing access to abilities that exist beneath conscious awareness. Others suggest that the danger itself is the key factor, that Edward's protective instincts are so strong and so attuned to Bella's well-being that they respond automatically when she is truly threatened, reaching across whatever distance separates them to warn her or guide her to safety, functioning like a supernatural alarm system that activates only when genuinely needed. This theory paints Edward as being far more connected to Bella than he realizes or admits, his subconscious mind maintaining constant vigilance even as his conscious self tries to forget her and move on. His love creating a monitoring system that operates beneath his awareness, a connection so deep that it functions autonomously without his knowledge or permission. In this interpretation, Edward's determination to leave Bella alone was always doomed to fail, because the bond between them was not something he could control or sever through willpower alone, but rather something that existed at a level beyond conscious choice. The motorcycle plan represents Bella's deliberate attempt to recreate the conditions that allowed her to hear Edward's voice, a strategic decision to seek out danger as a way of maintaining her connection to him. And the theories about this choice explore whether it was genuinely reckless or whether Bella understood on some level what she was doing and made a calculated decision about which risks were worth taking. When she spots the rusted motorcycles in someone's yard and immediately thinks of Jacob Black and his mechanical skills, when she buys them without hesitation despite having no money to spare and brings them to him with the explicit goal of learning to ride, she is not acting on impulse but rather executing a plan, using danger as a tool to achieve a specific psychological or supernatural result, demonstrating a level of agency and intentionality that complicates simple narratives about her self-destructive behavior. Some theorists view Bella's motorcycle scheme as deeply self-destructive, evidence that her depression had progressed to a point where she was actively seeking ways to harm herself, using the pretense of hearing Edward's voice to justify behavior that could easily result in serious injury or death. In this interpretation, Bella's claim that she simply wants to hear Edward's voice is a rationalization for suicidal ideation, a way of pursuing death without having to acknowledge that pursuit consciously, allowing her to maintain the fiction that she is trying to maintain connection rather than seeking an end to her suffering. The theorists who support this view point to the escalating nature of her recklessness, the way she moves from motorcycles to cliff diving, each activity more dangerous than the last, suggesting a pattern of behavior aimed at pushing boundaries until something finally breaks, until the danger becomes real and irreversible, until she crosses a line from which there is no return. But there is a more nuanced theory that suggests Bella's recklessness was not suicidal, but rather strategic, that she had discovered something important about the conditions under which she could hear Edward's voice, and was deliberately recreating those conditions because the brief moments of connection were worth whatever physical risks they entailed. In this interpretation, Bella was not trying to die, but rather trying to live, or at least trying to access the only thing that made her feel alive. And she calculated that the danger of motorcycles and other reckless activities was an acceptable price to pay for the relief of hearing Edward's voice, for the temporary easing of the constant ache of his absence. The theory suggests that Bella understood the risks she was taking and chose them consciously, that her behavior represented agency rather than self-destruction, a decision about what she was willing to sacrifice for moments of connection to the person she loved, a cost-benefit analysis that prioritized emotional survival over physical safety, because without those moments of hearing Edward's voice, without that proof that some connection still existed between them, she was not truly living anyway, but merely existing. Jacob Black's introduction into Bella's life during this period becomes inseparable from her adrenaline addiction, as he represents both the means by which she can pursue dangerous activities and also a complication to her single-minded focus on hearing Edward's voice. The theories about why Jacob was able to help Bella when others could not explore various possibilities, from simple human connection to more complex supernatural factors related to his emerging werewolf nature that he himself did not yet understand or recognize, The most straightforward explanation suggests that Jacob provided Bella with genuine friendship and human warmth at a time when she desperately needed both. That his uncomplicated affection and his willingness to spend time with her without demanding emotional vulnerability allowed her to begin healing in ways that had been impossible during her months of isolation. That his presence gave her something to focus on beyond her grief and her desperate need to hear Edward's voice, something positive and life-affirming that existed in the present rather than the past. But there are theories that propose Jacob's ability to help Bella was related to his supernatural nature. That even before his transformation into a werewolf, even when he himself did not know what he would become, there was something in his nature that provided a counterbalance to the vampire influence that had dominated Bella's life. Some theorists suggest that the natural antagonism between vampires and werewolves, the way their natures oppose and repel each other like magnetic poles with the same charge, meant that spending time with Jacob helped Bella break free from the hold Edward had on her consciousness. That Jacob's presence diluted or disrupted the connection that allowed her to hear Edward's voice, even as she was actively trying to strengthen that connection through dangerous behavior. In this reading, Jacob's warmth, both literal and metaphorical, worked against the cold emptiness that Edward's departure had left, filling some of the void even as Bella consciously resisted that healing because she wanted to maintain her connection to Edward above all else, because letting go of that connection felt like a betrayal of their love. The addiction metaphor becomes literal in some theoretical frameworks, with analysts comparing Bella's need to hear Edward's voice to substance dependence, noting the way she experiences withdrawal symptoms during his absence, develops tolerance requiring increasingly dangerous activities to achieve the same result, and prioritizes the pursuit of this experience above her own safety and the concerns of people who care about her. The parallel to addiction is strengthened by Bella's own descriptions of the experience. The way she talks about needing to hear Edward's voice, about the relief it provides, and the desperate measures she is willing to take to experience it again. Language that echoes the way addicts describe their relationship with their substance of choice, the way they organize their entire lives around the pursuit of their next fix, regardless of the consequences to themselves or others. She becomes increasingly willing to take greater risks for diminishing returns, a classic sign of addiction, where the initial intensity of the experience fades and higher doses or more extreme circumstances are required to achieve the same effect. Laurent's appearance in the meadow, that place that had been sacred to Bella and Edward, represents the first genuine mortal threat Bella faces during this period, moving beyond the theoretical danger of motorcycles and reckless driving to an encounter with a vampire who explicitly intends to kill her, who sees her as prey rather than as a person deserving of protection or consideration. The transformation of Jacob, black from Bella's sunshine friend into something ancient and powerful, represents one of the most significant mysteries of New Moon. A change that happens suddenly and without warning, leaving Bella confused and hurt as the one person who had been helping her heal suddenly disappears from her life without explanation, without even a phone call or a note to soften the blow of his absence. The theories surrounding Jacob's transformation explore not just the mechanics of how and when he first phased into a wolf, but also the deeper questions about what the pack knew, what they suspected, and how much of their behavior around Bella was shaped by knowledge they could not share, secrets they were bound to keep by forces beyond their control. The exact timeline of Jacob's transformation becomes crucial to understanding the events of this period, as the book itself is deliberately vague about when the change occurred, leaving theorists to piece together clues from Jacob's behavior, his mysterious illness, and the sudden shifts in his personality and availability that marked the before and after of his human existence. Some theorists propose that Jacob's first phase happened before the illness that kept him away from Bella for 2 weeks, that the fever and the isolation were not symptoms of the transformation itself, but rather the aftermath, the period during which Sam and the other pack members explained to Jacob what he had become and began training him to control his new abilities, to shift between forms at will rather than being at the mercy of his emotions. In this interpretation, Jacob's transformation was sudden and unexpected, perhaps triggered by a moment of intense emotion or danger, possibly even during one of his visits to Bella's house, when he felt particularly protective of her, or particularly angry about Edward's abandonment, and the illness that followed was actually a kind of psychological and physical adjustment period, his body and mind adapting to the enormous changes that had occurred, learning to navigate between human and wolf form, to control the temperature that now ran several degrees hotter than normal, to manage the constant awareness of his pack brother's thoughts invading his mind whenever he took his wolf form. But there are alternative theories suggesting that Jacob's illness was the transformation itself, that the fever represented his body's struggle to complete the change, a genetic activation so profound that it manifested as what appeared to be a serious illness, and that the 2 weeks he spent isolated from Bella were actually the period during which his first phase was occurring and recurring, his body shifting uncontrollably between forms as his genetics activated, and his connection to the pack solidified through repeated exposure to the pack mind. In this reading, Jacob's silence during this period was not just because Sam forbade him from contacting Bella, but because he was physically unable to do so, spending most of his time as a wolf, or in such an unstable state that human interaction was impossible. His consciousness fragmented between human thought and wolf instinct until he learned to maintain his human mind even in wolf form, until he mastered the trick of staying himself even when wearing a different shape. The theories become more specific when examining the exact moment of transformation, with some proposing that Jacob's first phase occurred during a confrontation with Paul, the most volatile member of the pack, whose temper was legendary even among werewolves known for their difficulty controlling their emotions. The evidence for this theory comes from Bella's later observation of Paul phasing in front of her, his instantaneous shift from human to wolf, triggered by anger, and the way this incident seemed to mirror something that had happened before, something Jacob referenced but did not fully explain. If Jacob's first transformation happened during an argument with Paul, perhaps a confrontation about Bella, or about Jacob's resistance to joining Sam's pack, or about the secrets being kept from him, it would explain both the suddenness of the change and the immediate integration into pack dynamics, as Paul's aggression would have forced Jacob to defend himself, and that defensive instinct would have triggered the transformation that had been waiting in his genes. The pack's knowledge of Bella before Jacob's transformation raises fascinating questions about how much Sam and the other wolves knew about her relationship with the Cullens. Whether they had been watching her specifically, or whether their awareness of her was more general, part of their broader mission to protect the tribe from vampire threats that might spill over onto the reservation or into the surrounding areas. Some theories suggest that Sam had been tracking Bella's movements since the Cullens left Forks, aware that a human who had been intimately involved with vampires might attract danger, might become a target for other vampires who learned of her connection to the Cullens and saw her as either a source of information or a tool for revenge. In this interpretation, the pack's protective instincts toward Bella predated Jacob's transformation, and their appearance at crucial moments like Laurent's attack in the meadow was not coincidental, but rather evidence of systematic surveillance, the pack maintaining watch over someone they recognized as vulnerable to supernatural threats, someone whose connection to their ancient enemies made her a person of interest, whether she knew it or not. But there are darker theories proposing that the pack initially saw Bella not as someone to protect, but as a potential threat herself. A human who knew too much about vampires and who might expose the existence of the supernatural world to others intentionally or accidentally, through carelessness or through a desire to share the burden of knowledge that must have weighed on her constantly. In this reading, Sam's interest in Bella before Jacob joined the pack was not protective, but evaluative. The alpha wolf assessing whether this girl who had been intimate with vampires posed a danger to the tribe's secrecy, whether she might need to be frightened away from La Push, or even eliminated if she proved to be a risk that could not be managed through less extreme means. Jacob's transformation and his immediate, intense connection to Bella would have complicated these calculations significantly, forcing the pack to reconsider their stance on her because one of their own had claimed her as important, as someone worth protecting rather than monitoring as a potential threat. And pack loyalty would demand that they honor Jacob's attachment, even if they questioned the wisdom of it. The question of whether Jacob could have imprinted on Bella generates intense theoretical debate among those who study the mechanics of werewolf bonding, with some arguing that his feelings for her were too intense, too immediate, too all-consuming to be explained by normal human attraction, while others maintain that imprinting is described as something unmistakable and instant, a connection that reshapes the imprinter's entire existence in a single moment, and that Jacob's feelings, however strong, developed gradually enough that they cannot be classified as imprinting in the technical sense that the term carries within Quileute culture. The theorists who support the imprinting hypothesis point to Jacob's obsessive need to be near Bella, his inability to stay away from her even when the pack dynamic and his obligations to Sam should have kept him distant, his willingness to break pack rules and risk Sam's anger for the chance to explain things to her, to maintain their connection despite the complications her knowledge of vampires created for pack security and the treaty obligations. They note that Jacob's transformation, which typically happens in moments of intense emotion or danger, might have been triggered specifically by his feelings for Bella, by the intensity of his need to protect her or be near her, and that this timing suggests something more than ordinary teenage affection, something rooted in the same supernatural mechanisms that govern imprinting even if the connection manifested differently. But the counter theory maintains that imprinting is fundamentally different from falling in love, that it creates a bond that is described as inevitable and unbreakable from the first moment, that removes all choice and agency from the imprinter in ways that are both beautiful and terrifying, and that Jacob's relationship with Bella, however intense, still involved choice and doubt, and the possibility of change in ways that true imprinting would not allow. That he could still feel anger toward her and frustration with her choices and doubt about whether their relationship could survive the complications of their respective connections to the supernatural world. Some theorists propose a middle ground, suggesting that Jacob experienced something like proto-imprinting, a connection that shared some characteristics with true imprinting, but remained incomplete. Perhaps because Bella's heart was already claimed by Edward. Perhaps because the supernatural bond between Bella and Edward created interference that prevented Jacob's imprinting mechanism from fully activating. In this interpretation, Jacob's feelings for Bella were stronger and more compulsive than normal human love, but not quite the absolute and transformative experience that true imprinting represents, leaving him caught in a painful middle state where he felt bound to Bella, but not in a way that she reciprocated or that the supernatural world recognized as legitimate. Sam's leadership of the pack and his reluctance to tell Jacob the truth about what he was becoming before the transformation occurred represents another area of theoretical exploration, as it seems strange that Sam would not warn Jacob about the possibility of his heritage activating, would not prepare him for what might happen so that the shock and confusion of the first transformation could be minimized, and Jacob could face the change with some understanding of what was occurring. Some theories suggest that Sam's silence was necessary, that telling Jacob about werewolves before he transformed would have violated some rule or tradition of the tribe, that the knowledge itself might have somehow interfered with the natural process of transformation, or that Sam believed knowledge without experience would only create fear and confusion rather than understanding, that Jacob needed to experience the change firsthand before any explanation would make sense to him. But there are more critical theories proposing that Sam's failure to warn Jacob was a strategic choice, that he wanted Jacob's transformation to happen naturally and without preconception, so that Sam could shape Jacob's understanding of what it meant to be a wolf, could ensure his loyalty to the pack and acceptance of Sam's leadership before Jacob had time to develop his own ideas about how the pack should function or what obligations came with their power. In this reading, Sam's control over the pack is not just a result of his alpha status, but also a carefully maintained system of indoctrination, where new wolves are kept ignorant until their transformation makes them vulnerable and dependent on Sam's guidance, ensuring that they accept his authority without question, that they internalize the pack hierarchy and the rules that govern their behavior before they have the confidence or the knowledge to challenge those structures. The theory becomes more complex when we consider that Jacob, as a direct descendant of the last chief who made the treaty with the Cullens, might have had the potential to challenge Sam's alpha status, to claim leadership of the pack based on his bloodline rather than the order of transformation. Some theorists suggest that Sam recognized this threat and deliberately kept Jacob ignorant to prevent him from understanding his own potential power until after Jacob had been integrated into the pack structure with Sam as the established leader, making any challenge to that authority seem like rebellion rather than a legitimate claim to leadership. The treaty's weight on the pack's behavior around Bella becomes increasingly significant as the theories explore how the ancient agreement between the Cullens and the Quileutes shaped every interaction, every decision about what information could be shared and what actions could be taken regarding this human girl who had been so intimate with their ancient enemies. The treaty explicitly forbade the Cullens from biting humans, from creating new vampires, and the fact that Bella remained human despite her intimate relationship with Edward might have been seen by some pack members as evidence that the Cullens had honored their agreement, that they had resisted the temptation to transform her, even though doing so would have solved many of the complications her humanity created for their relationship. But other pack members might have viewed Bella's continued humanity with suspicion, wondering why the Cullens had not simply killed her to protect their secret, questioning whether her knowledge of their nature represented a violation of the spirit, if not the letter of the treaty, whether allowing a human to know about vampires and live was itself a form of treaty violation that the pack should address. The mechanics of the treaty itself generate theoretical speculation, with questions about exactly what was promised and what consequences were established for violations. The red-haired vampire who haunts the edges of New Moon represents a threat that is all the more terrifying for being largely invisible. A predator stalking Bella with patience and cunning that transform her from a grieving girl into genuine prey. Victoria's revenge plot operates in the shadows of the narrative, glimpsed only in brief sightings and near misses, yet the theories surrounding her activities during this period reveal a campaign of psychological warfare and strategic planning far more sophisticated than a simple hunt. The question of what Victoria truly wanted and how she planned to achieve it opens up fascinating possibilities about vampire nature, about the mechanics of revenge, and about the ways that supernatural beings think about time and patience when they have eternity to plan their vengeance. The most straightforward theory suggests that Victoria's plan was always simple and direct, that she wanted to kill Bella as payment for James's death, to make Edward suffer the same loss he had inflicted on her when he destroyed her mate. In this interpretation, all of Victoria's circling and testing and patient observation were merely the necessary preliminaries to ensure success, the careful stalking of a predator who understands that rushing in without preparation could result in failure or her own destruction at the hands of the wolves who had claimed Bella's territory as their own. Victoria's gift of enhanced self-preservation, her supernatural ability to sense and evade danger, would have made her naturally cautious, naturally inclined toward thorough reconnaissance before committing to an attack, and her months of surveillance represent not hesitation, but rather the methodical approach of someone who understands that revenge is a dish best served with absolute certainty of success. But there are darker theories proposing that Victoria's true goal was not Bella's death, but rather her transformation, that Victoria understood on some level that the cruelest revenge against Edward would not be to kill his beloved, but rather to transform her into the very thing Edward had tried to protect her from becoming, to force upon Bella the immortality Edward had denied her, and then leave her alone to face eternity without the one person who could have guided her through it. In this reading, Victoria's patient stalking was not preparation for a killing blow, but rather an attempt to find the perfect moment and method to bite Bella and escape before the wolves could intervene, to create a newborn vampire and then disappear, leaving Edward to return to Fork someday and discover that his attempt to preserve Bella's humanity had failed, that his departure had directly resulted in the transformation he had sought to prevent. This theory finds support in Victoria's behavior patterns, the way she approaches but never quite commits to an attack, as though she is waiting for circumstances that would allow her to bite rather than kill, to inflict a wound that transforms rather than destroys. Laurent's role in Victoria's plan becomes crucial to understanding her strategy and her timeline, as his appearance in Forks and his conversation with Bella suggest coordination and planning rather than coincidence. The theories about whether Laurent was truly Victoria's ally or a reluctant participant in her scheme explore the complexity of vampire relationships and the question of what obligations exist between vampires who have traveled together. Some theorists propose that Laurent came to Forks specifically at Victoria's request, sent as a scout to assess the situation, to determine whether the Cullens had truly left or whether they were simply hiding, waiting to ambush any vampire foolish enough to threaten Bella in their absence. In this interpretation, Laurent's decision to kill Bella himself, rather than simply reporting back to Victoria, was a betrayal of his mission, an opportunistic choice to take advantage of what appeared to be an easy meal, rather than honoring his agreement with Victoria. But there are alternative theories suggesting that Laurent's attempt to kill Bella was exactly what Victoria wanted, that she had sent him as a test case, knowing that the wolves would likely intervene if Bella was threatened, and that Laurent's death at the hands of the pack would provide Victoria with crucial information about the strength and organization of this new threat. In this reading, Victoria sacrificed Laurent deliberately, using him as a tool to probe the defenses around Bella so that she could plan her own approach more effectively, and Laurent's warnings to Bella about Victoria's plans were genuine because he did not realize he was being used, did not understand that Victoria had sent him to his death to gather intelligence she needed. This theory paints Victoria as far more calculating than she initially appears, willing to sacrifice an ally to gain strategic advantage, demonstrating the kind of cold pragmatism that separates successful predators from those who act on impulse alone. The wolves' interference and how their presence completely disrupted Victoria's plans represents one of the most significant developments in her campaign, as the sudden emergence of the Quileute wolf pack created an obstacle she had not anticipated and could not easily overcome. The theories about how much Victoria knew about the wolves before encountering them explore whether she had any warning that this ancient bloodline might activate, whether she understood the history of the area well enough to predict that vampire activity might trigger transformations among the Quileute descendants. Some theories suggest that Victoria was completely blindsided by the wolves' appearance, that she had assumed the Cullens' departure meant the area was undefended, and that she could take her time stalking Bella without interference, only to discover that an entirely different supernatural force had claimed protection of the girl she sought to destroy. Victoria's evasion ability and how she used it to avoid capture by the wolf pack represents one of the most frustrating aspects of the hunt from the wolves' perspective, as they could track her scent and chase her, but could never quite catch her, never quite close the distance before she sensed the danger and escaped. The theories about Victoria's gift explore whether it operates on instinct or conscious choice, whether she is always aware of the safest path, or whether her ability functions more like a supernatural reflex that guides her movements without her having to think about each decision. Some theorists suggest that Victoria's gift makes her essentially uncatchable by conventional means, that she can sense threats before they fully materialize and adjust her position accordingly, creating a constantly updating map of danger in her mind that allows her to stay always one step ahead of pursuit. The mechanics of her gift generate fascinating speculation about its range and limitations, with some theories proposing that Victoria can sense danger up to several miles away, giving her enormous lead time to change course and avoid threats, while others suggest that her gift operates on a more immediate scale, but with such precision that she can navigate through danger with movements that appear prescient, always turning at exactly the right moment, always choosing the path that her pursuers will not anticipate. The question of whether Victoria's gift requires conscious attention or operates automatically becomes relevant when considering how exhausting it must be to be constantly on the run, constantly sensing and avoiding danger, and whether her gift allows her to rest or whether she must remain perpetually vigilant. The question of how Victoria's gift interacts with Alice's visions generates interesting speculation, as Alice should theoretically be able to see Victoria's decisions and predict where she will go. Yet Victoria consistently manages to evade not just the wolves, but also any trap that might be set based on Alice's predictions. Some theories propose that Victoria's gift of self-preservation extends to hiding her from precognitive abilities, that her power to sense and avoid danger includes the ability to sense when someone is trying to predict her movements and to make her decisions in ways that defy prediction. Others suggest that Alice's absence from Forks for most of this period means that no one with precognitive abilities was actively trying to track Victoria, and that if Alice had been present and focused on finding her, Victoria's evasion would have been much more difficult or perhaps even impossible, that the combination of Alice's visions and the wolves' physical pursuit would have created a net that Victoria could not escape. The red-haired vampire sightings that occur throughout Bella's time with Jacob create a timeline of Victoria's campaign, a pattern of approaches and retreats that suggests testing and learning rather than random wandering. The theories about each sighting explore what Victoria might have been trying to accomplish, what information she was gathering, and how her strategy evolved as she learned more about the wolves and their protection of Bella. The first sightings, occurring shortly after the Cullens' departure, suggest that Victoria began her hunt almost immediately, that she had been waiting for the Cullens to leave before making her move, perhaps monitoring them from a distance and recognizing that Edward's departure created the opportunity she needed. This timing indicates that Victoria had been planning her revenge for months, possibly since James's death in that ballet studio in Phoenix, waiting patiently for the right moment to strike when the Cullens' guard was down. Later sightings that occur closer to La Bouche and even on the reservation itself suggest growing boldness or desperation. Victoria testing the boundaries of the wolves' territory and their willingness to defend it, perhaps trying to determine if there were gaps in their patrol patterns or moments when Bella might be vulnerable. Some theorists propose that Victoria was deliberately drawing the wolves away from other areas, using herself as bait to thin out their numbers in specific locations so that she or an accomplice could approach Bella from an unexpected direction. The fact that Victoria never actually attempts to attack Bella during these sightings, despite having numerous opportunities when Bella was outdoors or in transit between locations, suggests either that Victoria was waiting for some specific condition to be met, or that she was gathering information rather than actively trying to complete her mission during this phase. Edward's ignorance of Victoria's hunt becomes a point of significant theoretical interest, as the question of whether he knew that Victoria was stalking Bella affects our understanding of his decision to stay away and his state of mind during their separation. The moment when Bella stands at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the churning grey water far below, represents perhaps the most controversial and analysed decision in all of New Moon, a choice that has generated endless debate about her true intentions, her mental state, and whether she was seeking death or merely seeking the voice that had become her only connection to the love she had lost. The theories surrounding the cliff diving incident explore the fine line between suicidal ideation and reckless behavior, between a genuine death wish and a calculated risk taken for reasons that others might not understand, but that made perfect sense to someone living in the kind of emotional void that Bella inhabited during Edward's absence. The question of Bella's true intentions when she climbed to the top of that cliff and prepared to jump divides theorists into camps that range from those who believe she was actively suicidal to those who maintain she was simply reckless, willing to risk death, but not actively seeking it, and still others who propose that she understood exactly what she was doing and had calculated that the risk was acceptable given what she hoped to gain. The evidence for suicidal intent comes from multiple sources, including Bella's own descriptions of the emptiness she felt, the hole in her chest that never healed, the way she moved through life like a ghost going through motions without any real investment in her own survival or happiness, her choice to jump alone, without telling anyone where she was going, without any safety precautions or backup plan, suggests someone who at minimum did not care much whether she lived or died, and at maximum was hoping that the ocean would solve a problem she could not solve herself. But there are compelling counter-arguments suggesting that Bella's jump was not suicidal, but rather the logical extension of her adrenaline addiction. Her discovery that dangerous situations allowed her to hear Edward's voice and feel connected to him in a way that nothing else could provide. In this interpretation, cliff diving represented simply another escalation in a pattern of behavior that had begun with motorcycles and continued through various forms of recklessness, each one slightly more dangerous than the last, but each one calculated to produce the adrenaline spike that seemed to open a channel between her consciousness and Edward's voice. The fact that she had watched Jacob and his friends cliff dive successfully, that she knew it was possible to survive the jump if done correctly, suggests that she had some basis for believing she could accomplish this feat without dying, that she was taking a risk but not throwing her life away. The timing of her decision to jump becomes significant in understanding her mental state, as she chooses this particular day, this particular moment, when the weather is bad and the ocean is rough, and Jacob is away dealing with Harry Clearwater's death. Some theories suggest that the timing was deliberate that Bella chose the worst possible conditions because she wanted to maximize the danger, and therefore maximize the intensity of Edward's voice when it came, while others proposed that she acted impulsively, that the combination of her emotional state and the opportunity presented by Jacob's absence led her to make a decision she might not have made under different circumstances. The fact that she does not tell anyone where she is going, does not leave a note or make any arrangements in case something goes wrong, suggests either supreme confidence that nothing will go wrong, or complete indifference to the possibility of her own death. Alice's vision of Bella jumping from the cliff, and how Alice interpreted what she saw, becomes crucial to understanding the chain of events that follows, as Alice's belief that Bella was committing suicide sets in motion, the tragic misunderstanding that nearly results in Edward's death. The theories about what Alice actually saw in her vision explore the limitations and peculiarities of her gift, particularly the fact that she cannot see the wolves and therefore could not see Jacob's presence in the water or his rescue of Bella after she jumped. In Alice's vision, Bella would have appeared to jump into the churning ocean and then simply disappear, with no indication of what happened next, no image of her emerging from the water or returning to shore. And this incomplete picture naturally led Alice to the worst possible conclusion. Some theorists propose that Alice's vision was further complicated by the werewolf blind spot, that Jacob's presence in the water created a kind of static or interference that made it impossible for Alice to see clearly what was happening, so that she perceived only fragments of the event, enough to know that Bella was in mortal danger, but not enough to understand that the danger would be averted. Others suggest that Alice's interpretation of the vision was colored by her knowledge of Bella's depression and her awareness of how much Bella had been suffering since Edward left, making it easy for Alice to assume that what she was seeing was a suicide attempt, rather than simply another instance of Bella's reckless behavior. The ocean's danger and whether Bella truly understood the risk she was taking becomes another point of theoretical exploration, as the water conditions on the day she jumped were far worse than they had been when she watched Jacob and his friends diving, with storms brewing and currents that made the swim back to shore genuinely life-threatening, even for someone who survived the initial impact. Some theorists argue that Bella's lack of experience with the ocean, her failure to understand how different the conditions were from when she had observed the wolves jumping, represents evidence that she was not thinking clearly, that her judgment was so impaired by depression and obsession that she could not accurately assess the danger she was facing. In this reading, even if Bella did not intend to die, her jump was so poorly calculated and so dangerous that it amounted to the same thing, a form of passive suicide where death is welcomed even if not actively sought. But other theorists maintain that Bella did understand the risk and chose to take it anyway, that she made a conscious decision that hearing Edward's voice one more time was worth the possibility of dying, that the brief connection she would experience during the fall and the swim was more valuable to her than continued existence without that connection. This interpretation paints Bella as more aware and more in control than the suicide theory allows, someone making a choice that others might consider irrational, but that made perfect sense within the framework of her values and priorities, where emotional and spiritual survival mattered more than physical safety. Edward's reaction when Alice tells him about Bella's jump, the way he immediately assumes she has killed herself and cannot be convinced otherwise, reveals how deeply he has been affected by their separation and how his own guilt and self-loathing have shaped his perception of what Bella might do in his absence. The theories about Edward's mental state at this moment explore whether his immediate assumption of suicide reflects accurate understanding of how much pain Bella was in, or whether it reflects his own depressive tendencies and his belief that anyone who truly knew him would eventually want to escape that knowledge through death. Some theorists suggest that Edward's reaction is colored by projection, that he has been contemplating his own death since leaving Bella, and therefore assumes she must be contemplating hers, unable to imagine that she might be surviving or even finding ways to cope, because he himself has found no way to cope with their separation. The question of whether Edward was already planning to seek death from the Volturi before he learned of Bella's supposed suicide generates significant debate, with some theorists proposing that Alice's phone call simply provided the trigger for a plan he had been developing for months, while others maintain that Edward had been managing to survive, however miserably, until the belief that Bella was dead removed his last reason for continuing to exist. The evidence for premeditation comes from how quickly Edward formulates his plan and travels to Italy, suggesting he had perhaps already thought through the mechanics of how one might convince the Volturi to grant death to a vampire who wanted to die, while the evidence against premeditation comes from Alice's description of Edward's state when she reaches him, his absolute devastation suggesting genuine shock, rather than the execution of a plan long in the making. Jacob's rescue of Bella and his role in preventing what could have been her death adds another layer of complexity to the theory surrounding this incident, as the question of whether Jacob happened to be in the water coincidentally or whether he had been watching Bella becomes significant in understanding the wolf's protective instincts toward her. Some theories propose that Jacob saw Bella heading toward the cliffs and followed her, concerned about what she might do, but not wanting to confront her directly, hoping perhaps that she would change her mind or that he could intervene if necessary without making his presence known. In this interpretation, Jacob's rescue was not coincidence, but rather the result of his constant vigilance, his inability to stop watching over Bella, even when they were supposedly no longer friends, his protective instincts that went deeper than friendship or even romantic love, touching something fundamental in his nature as a wolf. But other theorists suggest that Jacob's presence was genuinely coincidental, that he happened to be in his wolf form patrolling the area and noticed Bella's scent or saw her jump, and that his rescue was a spur-of-the-moment decision rather than part of any ongoing surveillance. The question of what Jacob was thinking during the rescue, whether he understood immediately why Bella had jumped or whether he simply saw her in danger and acted without analyzing her motivations, affects our understanding of their relationship and the depth of his insight into her psychological state. Harry Clearwater's death and how its timing intersects with Bella's cliff diving creates a tragic confluence of events that shapes everything that follows, as the Clearwater family's crisis means that Jacob cannot stay with Bella after rescuing her, cannot provide the support and explanation she needs, leaving her alone and confused at the worst possible moment. The theories about whether Harry's death was connected to the stress of the vampire threat, whether the constant patrol duties and the awareness of Victoria's presence had taken a toll on his health. Explore the hidden costs of the wolves' protection of Bella. Some theorists propose that Harry's heart attack was directly caused by the strain of knowing about the supernatural threats facing the tribe, that his transformation many years earlier had left lasting effects on his cardiovascular system, or that the stress of watching his son Seth go through transformation had been too much for his aging body to handle. Alice's return to Forks and her unexpected appearance at Bella's house represents a moment of hope that quickly becomes complicated by misunderstanding and miscommunication, as Alice arrives believing Bella is dead, only to find her alive, setting off a chain of events that neither of them could have predicted. The theories about why Alice came back explore her motivations and her sense of obligation to Bella, with some suggesting that Alice felt responsible for Bella's supposed death because she had not been watching closely enough, had not maintained the vigilance that might have prevented the tragedy, while others propose that Alice came back because she wanted to say goodbye, to honor Bella's memory, and perhaps to confront Rosalie about her role in keeping Alice away from someone who clearly needed help. The question of what Alice expected to find when she arrived in Forks generates interesting speculation, as she must have known that Bella was dead based on her visions, and yet she came anyway, suggesting that her motivations went beyond practical concerns to something more emotional or sentimental. Some theorists propose that Alice wanted to attend Bella's funeral, to be present for Charlie in his grief, even though she had no official reason to be there, while others suggest that Alice hoped against hope that her vision had been wrong, that somehow Bella had survived despite what Alice had seen, and that this hope was strong enough to bring her back to Forks, even though logic told her it was futile. Rosalie's phone call to Edward and her decision to tell him that Bella was dead represents one of the most controversial actions in the entire saga, as the question of why Rosalie made this call and what she hoped to accomplish divides theorists into camps that view her as either malicious or misguided. The journey to Italy represents the culmination of Edward's self-destructive impulses, a decision born from grief so profound that death seems not just acceptable but necessary, the only logical response to a loss that has shattered his reason for existing. The theories surrounding Edward's plan to die explore the psychology of a vampire who has lived for over a century, but finds that existence unbearable without the one person who gave his life meaning, and they examine the specific choice he makes about how to die, why he selects the Volturi as the instrument of his destruction, and what his dramatic plan to expose himself in sunlight reveals about his character and his state of mind. This is not a simple suicide attempt, but rather an elaborate performance, a statement that says something about who Edward is and what he believes about himself and his place in the world. The question of whether Edward was genuinely suicidal or whether some part of him hoped to be saved generates intense debate among theorists who analyze his actions and his psychology during this crisis. The evidence for genuine suicidal intent is overwhelming, as Edward makes clear to Alice and later to Bella that he cannot and will not continue to exist in a world where Bella is dead, that her loss has removed the only thing that made his vampire existence bearable, that without her, he is simply a monster with no purpose or redemption. His speed in formulating and executing his plan, the way he moves immediately from learning of Bella's supposed death to arranging his own, suggests someone who's been pushed past the breaking point and sees no other option, no other path forward that does not involve endless centuries of grief and guilt and emptiness. But there are theories proposing that Edward's choice of the Volturi specifically, rather than other methods of vampire suicide that might have been more certain or more private, suggests some unconscious desire to be stopped, some part of him that hoped someone would intervene before he could complete his plan. The Volturi, after all, do not grant death easily or automatically to vampires who request it, and Edward's plan requires him to commit a violation of their laws so egregious that they will have no choice but to destroy him, which introduces multiple points at which the plan could fail or be interrupted. A vampire truly committed to death might have chosen exposure to sunlight in a more permanent and irrevocable way, might have sought out a situation where rescue would be impossible. But Edward's plan, while dramatic and dangerous, leaves room for intervention if someone arrives in time and can convince him to reconsider. The reasons why Edward chose Italy and the Volturi specifically, rather than other potential methods of ending his existence, reveal much about his psychology and his understanding of vampire society. Some theories suggest that Edward chose the Volturi because he believed that dying at the hands of vampire royalty, being destroyed for violating their laws, carried a kind of dignity or nobility that other forms of death would not provide, that it transformed his suicide from an act of despair into an act of sacrifice, a deliberate choice to die for breaking a law rather than simply giving up on existence. In this interpretation, Edward needed his death to mean something, to be about more than just his inability to continue living, and dying as a lawbreaker executed by the Volturi provided that meaning, allowed him to frame his death as punishment for his crimes rather than surrender to grief. But there are darker theories proposing that Edward chose the Volturi because he wanted to hurt himself as much as possible before dying, that he sought not just death, but judgment, condemnation, confirmation from the most powerful vampires in existence that he was indeed the monster he had always believed himself to be. The Volturi's reputation for cruelty, for using Jane's gift to torture those who displeased them before granting the mercy of destruction, might have appealed to Edward's self-loathing, his belief that he deserved to suffer for failing to protect Bella, for leaving her vulnerable to the despair that led to her supposed suicide. In this reading, Edward's choice of the Volturi was about seeking the maximum possible punishment, making his death as painful and degrading as possible because anything less would not adequately atone for his failures. The Sun Revelation Plan. Edward's decision to expose himself as a vampire by stepping into sunlight in the middle of a crowded festival in Volterra represents an interesting choice that has generated significant theoretical analysis. The dramatic nature of this plan, the way it would expose the existence of vampires to hundreds or thousands of humans simultaneously, guarantees a response from the Volturi, but also reveals something about Edward's state of mind, his need to make a statement, to ensure that his death is witnessed and understood, rather than occurring quietly in some private chamber of the Volturi stronghold. Some theories suggest that Edward's choice of this particular method reflects his artistic nature, his sense of aesthetics and drama, his desire to make his death beautiful in some twisted way, to sparkle in the Italian sun one final time before being destroyed for revealing what he is. But there are theories proposing that the public nature of Edward's planned revelation was specifically designed to give the Volturi no choice but to kill him. That he understood they might try to recruit him instead if he approached them privately and requested death, but that a public exposure would force their hand, make his destruction necessary to protect the secret of vampire existence. In this interpretation, Edward's plan was carefully calculated to eliminate any possibility of the Volturi refusing his death wish, to create a situation where killing him was not just permitted, but required by their own laws and their need to maintain secrecy. Aro's likely response to Edward's plan, and whether the Volturi would have truly killed him or attempted to recruit him instead, becomes a subject of fascinating speculation, as we know from later books that Aro covets useful gifts and is always seeking to expand his collection of talented vampires. Edward's mind-reading ability is extraordinarily powerful and rare, exactly the kind of gift that Aro would want to add to his guard, and the theories explore whether Aro would have been willing to execute Edward despite the loss of such a valuable ability, or whether he would have found some way to spare Edward's life and coerce him into service. Some theorists propose that Aro would have indeed killed Edward as he planned, that the public nature of the exposure would have left no alternative, that even Aro's desire to collect gifted vampires would be outweighed by the need to maintain secrecy and demonstrate the consequences of violating that secrecy. But others suggest that Aro might have found a way to save Edward despite the public exposure, perhaps by claiming that Edward was mentally unstable and needed to be contained rather than destroyed, perhaps by using Chelsea's gift to manipulate Edward's bonds and desires so that he no longer wished to die, perhaps by offering some compromise that would allow Edward to live while still satisfying the demands of vampire law. In this reading, Edward's plan was flawed from the beginning because he did not fully understand Aro's greed for gifted vampires or his willingness to bend his own rules when something he wanted was at stake. Alice's vision of Edward's plan and how much she actually saw versus how much she inferred or interpreted becomes relevant to understanding how she knew to intervene and how she convinced Bella to race to Italy to stop him. The theories about the accuracy and completeness of Alice's visions during this crisis explore whether she saw Edward's death as a certainty or as one possible outcome among many, whether she understood the full details of his plan or only glimpsed fragments that she had to piece together. Some theorists propose that Alice saw multiple possible futures branching from Edward's decision, some in which he died and some in which he was saved, and that she recognized that Bella's presence was the key factor that determined which future would come to pass, that only Bella appearing alive could convince Edward to abandon his plan. The race against time to reach Italy before Edward can expose himself creates enormous tension and raises questions about timing and logistics that theorists have explored in detail. Alice's ability to see the future should theoretically allow her to know exactly when Edward will make his move, giving her and Bella a target time they must reach Volterra by. But the uncertainties introduced by Edward's ability to change his plans and the limitations of Alice's gift create genuine suspense about whether they will arrive in time. Some theories suggest that Edward was deliberately delaying his exposure, that some part of him was waiting to see if a miracle would occur, if Bella would somehow return from the dead and give him a reason to continue existing, while others proposed that practical considerations like the festival schedule and the Volturi's availability dictated his timing rather than any psychological hesitation. The question of what Edward was thinking and feeling during the time between learning of Bella's supposed death and his arrival in Volterra generates theories about his psychological state, his preparations for death, and whether he experienced any doubt or hesitation about his plan. Some theorists paint Edward as being in a state of absolute conviction, his grief so overwhelming that death seems not just desirable but inevitable, necessary, the only possible response to a loss that has destroyed everything he cared about. In this interpretation, Edward moved through the preparations for his death with mechanical efficiency, his mind already half detached from his body, already beginning the process of letting go of existence before the physical end had even arrived. But there are more complex theories suggesting that Edward experienced significant inner turmoil during this period, that he vacillated between determination and doubt, that he questioned whether he had the right to throw away his existence when his family still needed him, when Carlyle and Esme would grieve his loss, when his death would add to the suffering in the world rather than reducing it. In this reading, Edward's arrival in Volterra represents not the inevitable conclusion of his grief, but rather the outcome of an intense internal struggle that he ultimately lost, his despair winning out over his sense of obligation to his family and his awareness that suicide would hurt those who loved him. Marcus's presence in the Volturi and his ability to see relationship bonds becomes relevant to theories about how the confrontation in Volterra might have unfolded, as Marcus would have been able to perceive immediately that Edward was motivated by the loss of a mate bond, that his request for death was driven by grief for a lost love rather than simple despair or mental instability. Some theories suggest that Marcus might have felt sympathy for Edward's situation, that he would have recognized in Edward's grief an echo of his own eternal mourning for Didymus, and that this sympathy might have made Marcus more inclined to grant Edward's wish for death, rather than forcing him to continue existing in pain. In this interpretation, Marcus, among all the Volturi, would have understood most deeply what Edward was experiencing and why death might seem like mercy rather than tragedy. Caius's likely hostility toward Edward and his eagerness to destroy him represents another factor in how the Volturi confrontation might have proceeded, as Caius is characterized as the most violent and least forgiving of the Volturi leaders, the one most likely to see Edward's planned exposure as an unforgivable crime deserving immediate execution. The theories about Caius's role explore whether he would have advocated for Edward's death, regardless of Aro's interest in his gift, whether Caius's desire to enforce vampire law strictly would have overridden any strategic considerations about preserving valuable abilities. Some theorists propose that Caius would have been Edward's best hope for achieving his goal of death, that if Aro had hesitated or tried to find a way to spare Edward's life, Caius would have insisted on immediate execution, making him an unlikely ally in Edward's suicide attempt. Jane's gift and the torture she could inflict becomes relevant to theories about what Edward would have experienced in Volturi custody, whether the moments before his planned death would have involved the kind of pain that Jane specializes in delivering, Some theories suggest that the Volturi would have used Jane's gift on Edward as punishment for his attempted exposure, that they would have made him suffer before granting him death, and that Edward, in his suicidal state, would have welcomed this torture as appropriate punishment for his failures. In this reading, Edward's plan involved not just death but also pain, a final atonement through suffering before being released from existence, and Jane's presence in the Volturi made this aspect of his plan almost certain to occur. The question of whether Edward considered the impact his death would have on his family, particularly on Carlisle and Esme, who loved him as a son, generates theories about his psychological state and his capacity for considering anything beyond his own grief. The throne room of the Volturi represents the heart of vampire civilization, a place where ancient laws are enforced and the fate of their kind is decided by 3 immortal kings who have ruled for millennia. And when Bella bursts through those doors to save Edward from his planned destruction, she steps into a political situation far more complex than a simple choice between life and death. The theories surrounding the Volturi confrontation explore what the ancient vampires truly wanted from this encounter, whether they were genuinely interested in destroying Edward, or whether they saw an opportunity to acquire valuable assets for their collection, and how Bella's unexpected appearance and her mysterious immunity to vampire gifts transformed a straightforward execution into a negotiation with implications that would echo through the rest of the saga. Aro's true motives in this confrontation become the subject of intense theoretical scrutiny, as the question of whether he wanted Edward, Alice, Bella, or all 3 shapes our understanding of how the scene unfolded and why the Volturi ultimately allowed them to leave. The most straightforward interpretation suggests that Aro was primarily interested in Edward, whose mind-reading ability would be an invaluable addition to the Volturi Guard, allowing Aro to know the thoughts not just of those he touches, but of everyone in his vicinity through Edward's constant scanning of nearby minds. In this reading, Aro's interest in sparing Edward's life despite his attempted exposure was motivated entirely by desire to acquire his gift, and the eventual decision to let Edward leave represented a rare failure on Aro's part, a situation where his usual tactics of persuasion and coercion did not work because Edward's suicidal determination made him impossible to manipulate through normal means. But there are more complex theories proposing that Aro's primary interest was actually in Alice, whose precognitive abilities would be even more valuable to the Volturi than Edward's mind reading, as the ability to see the future would give the Volturi an enormous strategic advantage in their efforts to maintain control over the vampire world. Some theorists point to Aro's extensive questioning of Alice during the confrontation, his fascination with her visions, and his attempts to understand the mechanics and limitations of her gift, as evidence that she was his true target all along, that Edward's attempted suicide simply provided a convenient excuse to bring the Cullens into contact with the Volturi, so that Aro could make his pitch for Alice to join them. In this interpretation, Aro was willing to let Edward go because he had never really wanted Edward in the first place, or at least not as much as he wanted Alice, and his apparent interest in Edward was partially a negotiating tactic to make Alice feel that she owed the Volturi something for sparing her brother's life. The theory that Aro was most interested in Bella herself, despite her mortality and her lack of any obvious supernatural abilities at the time, represents perhaps the most intriguing possibility, as it suggests that Aro perceived something in Bella that even she did not yet understand about herself. The evidence for this theory comes from Aro's fascination with Bella's immunity to his gift, his inability to read her thoughts when he touched her hand, and his immediate recognition that this immunity represented something significant, a mental shield that might manifest as an even more powerful gift once she was transformed into a vampire. Some theorists propose that Aro understood immediately that Bella's shield could be one of the most valuable defensive gifts in the vampire world, that a vampire who could block mental attacks would be nearly impossible to defeat through supernatural means, and that acquiring Bella for the Volturi before she was transformed became Aro's primary goal during this confrontation. The vote to transform Bella and the ultimatum that she must become a vampire or be destroyed has generated extensive theoretical analysis about whether this were truly about enforcing vampire law, or whether it represented a strategic move by Aro to ensure that Bella would eventually become available for recruitment to the Volturi Guard. The official justification for the ultimatum is simple: that Bella knows too much about vampires to be allowed to remain human indefinitely, that her continued mortality represents a security risk that must be addressed either through transformation or death. But some theories suggest that Aro's insistence on Bella's transformation was motivated less by concern about security and more by desire to see what kind of vampire she would become, to observe how her mental shield would develop and strengthen, and to position himself to make another recruitment attempt once she had been transformed and her full abilities had manifested. The question of whether the ultimatum was merciful or manipulative divides theorists into camps that view Aro's decision very differently. Those who see the ultimatum as merciful point out that Aro could have ordered Bella's immediate death for knowing about vampires, that allowing her time to be transformed and giving the Cullens the responsibility for that transformation represented unusual leniency from vampires who are normally strict about enforcing their laws. In this interpretation, Aro was genuinely trying to find a solution that would satisfy the demands of vampire law while also preserving Bella's life, demonstrating that he was not simply a tyrant, but someone capable of nuance and compromise when circumstances permitted. But the darker interpretation suggests that Aro's ultimatum was manipulative, that he was creating a situation where Bella would be forced to become a vampire whether she truly wanted transformation or not, removing her choice and her agency under the guise of enforcing vampire law. In this reading, Aro recognized that Edward was preventing Bella's transformation out of his own desire to preserve her humanity, and the ultimatum was designed to override Edward's resistance, to make transformation mandatory rather than optional, ensuring that Bella would eventually become the powerful vampire that Aro wanted her to be. The fact that the Volturi set no specific timeline for the transformation, allowing the Cullens to return to Forks and handle the matter on their own schedule, suggests that Aro was more interested in ensuring transformation happened eventually than in enforcing any immediate consequence for Bella's knowledge of vampire existence. Bella's shield, and when it first manifested, becomes a crucial question in understanding the Volturi confrontation. As theories explore whether her immunity to mental gifts was always present, or whether it emerged specifically in response to the danger she faced in the throne room, The evidence suggests that Bella's shield existed before this encounter, as Edward had never been able to read her mind, and Ara's gift failed to work on her just as Edward's had. But some theorists propose that the shield strengthened or became more conscious in response to the concentrated attention of multiple gifted vampires trying to affect her mind simultaneously. In this interpretation, the Volturi confrontation represented the first time Bella's shield was truly tested, the first time it had to defend against multiple forms of mental intrusion at once, and this stress caused the shield to reinforce itself, to become more robust and more comprehensive in its protection. Jane's inability to cause Bella pain with her gift represents one of the most significant revelations of the confrontation, as it demonstrated that Bella's immunity extended beyond thought reading to include other mental attacks, that her shield protected against any gift that targeted the mind rather than the body. The theories about Jane's reaction to this failure explore her psychology and her sense of identity, as Jane's entire existence within the Volturi is predicated on her ability to cause pain, to torture anyone who displeases the Volturi leaders or threatens their authority. Some theorists suggest that Jane's anger at being unable to affect Bella was not just frustration at a failed attack, but genuine existential crisis, a moment when her understanding of herself and her place in the world was challenged by the existence of someone immune to her most fundamental ability. The question of whether Jane would have continued to try to hurt Bella through other means, whether her failure with her gift would have led her to resort to physical violence, generates interesting speculation about Jane's psychology and the limits of her cruelty. Some theories propose that Jane's sadism is so deeply connected to her gift that she would have little interest in causing pain through conventional physical means, that the psychological satisfaction she derives from using her supernatural ability would not be replicated by simply attacking Bella with her hands or teeth. But other theories suggest that Jane's hatred of Bella, her fury at being unable to affect her with her gift, would have driven her to find other ways to cause suffering, that she would have taken pleasure in any form of Bella's pain, regardless of how it was inflicted. Alec's presence during the confrontation and the question of whether his gift would have been effective against Bella generates theoretical discussion about the nature of Bella's shield and what kinds of attacks it can and cannot defend against. Alec's gift works differently from Jane's, creating a sensory deprivation rather than sensory overload, cutting his victims off from all sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch so that they exist in a void of nothingness. The theories about whether this gift would have worked on Bella explore whether her shield protects against all mental attacks or only those that introduce something into the mind, rather than removing something from it. Some theorists propose that Alec's gift might have bypassed Bella's shield because it does not actually attack the mind, but rather blocks the transmission of sensory information before it reaches the mind, functioning at a different level than Jane's pain illusions or Edward's thought reading. The Volturi's collection of gifted vampires and their habit of recruiting powerful abilities becomes relevant to understanding why they were so interested in the Cullens and why they ultimately let them leave despite having reasons to destroy at least some of them. The theories about the Volturi's recruitment strategy explore whether they genuinely believe they are building the strongest possible guard to enforce vampire law, or whether their collection of gifts is more about power and control, a about ensuring that no other coven could possibly challenge their authority. Some theorists view the Volturi as relatively benevolent, using their power to maintain stability in the vampire world and prevent the kind of chaos that would result if vampires exposed themselves to humans or engaged in unlimited warfare with each other, while others see them as tyrannical, maintaining control through fear and violence and crushing any potential opposition before it can organize. Chelsea's role in the Volturi and her gift of manipulating emotional bonds becomes crucial to theories about whether the Volturi tried to use her ability on the Cullens during the confrontation, whether Chelsea attempted to weaken the bonds between the Cullen family members or to create artificial loyalty to the Volturi that would make recruitment easier. Some theories propose that Chelsea was actively using her gift throughout the confrontation, trying to weaken Edward's attachment to his family so that he would be more willing to join the Volturi, trying to strengthen Aro's appeal to Alice so that she would see joining the Guard as an attractive option, and possibly even trying to manipulate Bella's feelings to make her more compliant and less resistant to the idea of staying in Volterra. The fact that none of these attempts succeeded, that the Cullens left Volterra with their family bonds intact and their loyalty to each other unshaken, might suggest that Bella's shield was protecting not just her own mind, but somehow interfering with Chelsea's ability to affect those near her. Or alternatively, that Chelsea's gift has limits when working against very strong existing bonds. Dimitri's tracking ability and how close he came to actually tracking Edward before Bella and Alice arrived generates interesting theoretical speculation about the mechanics of his gift and whether Edward could have evaded him indefinitely if he had chosen to run rather than seek death from the Volturi. Dimitri is described as the greatest tracker in the vampire world, able to find anyone anywhere once he has identified their mental signature, making him invaluable to the Volturi for tracking down lawbreakers and fugitives. The theories about whether Edward could have hidden from Dimitri explore whether there are any limitations to the tracking gift, whether there are places or methods that could block or confuse it, or whether Dimitri's ability is truly absolute and inescapable. The return to Forks brings not resolution, but rather the beginning of new conflicts as the Cullen family gathers to vote on Bella's transformation, a democratic process that reveals the complex web of opinions and emotions surrounding her potential immortality. The theories about each family member's vote explore their motivations and their understanding of what Bella's transformation would mean, not just for her, but for the entire family and their carefully constructed existence in the human world. Carlyle votes yes, his decision rooted in respect for Bella's autonomy and his belief that she has the right to choose her own path, that denying her transformation when she desperately wants it would be a form of cruelty he cannot justify. Esme votes yes as well, her maternal love for Bella overriding any concerns about the loss of humanity, seeing in Bella someone who already belongs to their family in spirit, if not yet in form. Emmett's enthusiastic yes reflects his straightforward nature and his excitement at the prospect of having Bella as a permanent sister, someone who can truly participate in their world without the constant fear and limitation that her humanity imposes. Rosalie's no becomes the most analysed vote, as theories explore whether her refusal comes from genuine concern for Bella's well-being or from resentment and jealousy, that Bella would choose to give up the human experiences that Rosalie mourns losing. Some theorists see Rosalie's vote as protective, an attempt to save Bella from making a choice she cannot undo, to preserve her humanity and her options before she commits to an eternity she may come to regret, while others interpret her vote as more selfish, rooted in anger that Bella does not appreciate the gift of human life that Rosalie would give anything to have back. Alice votes yes with absolute certainty, having seen Bella's future as a vampire and knowing that this transformation is inevitable, that fighting against it is fighting against the tide of fate itself. Jasper's yes carries weight because he has the most experience with newborn vampires, understanding better than anyone except perhaps Carlyle the challenges and dangers that Bella will face, and his willingness to vote for her transformation despite these concerns suggests confidence that she can survive the transition and that the family can help her through it. Edward's resistance throughout this process, his determination to prevent Bella's transformation despite the Volturi's ultimatum and despite Bella's own wishes, reveals the depth of his self-loathing and his inability to accept that Bella might genuinely want to become what he considers a monster. The theories about Edward's opposition explore whether it is truly about protecting Bella, or whether it is about protecting himself from the guilt of being responsible for her transformation, from having to watch her lose her humanity and become something he believes is inherently evil. The compromise that emerges, marriage before transformation, represents Edward's attempt to maintain some control over the situation while also honoring Bella's wishes, and the theories about this bargain explore what it reveals about his character and his values. Edward's insistence on marriage before transformation reflects his traditional values, his belief in doing things the right way according to human customs. But some theorists suggest it also represents a delay tactic, a way of postponing the transformation he dreads, while appearing to accept its inevitability. Alice's vision of the wedding becomes both promise and manipulation, a glimpse of a future that could be beautiful if Bella agrees to Edward's terms. And some theories propose that Alice shares this vision strategically, knowing it will make Bella more willing to accept the compromise even though she finds the idea of a big wedding embarrassing and unnecessary. The unresolved Victoria threat that lurks in the background, waiting to explode into the events of Eclipse, reminds us that the confrontation in Volterra solved nothing about the immediate dangers facing Bella, that returning to Forks means returning to a place where a vengeful vampire is still plotting her destruction. Jacob's heartbreak and the seeds of the conflict that will dominate Eclipse are planted in these final moments, as Jacob realizes that Bella's future with Edward is not just probable but certain, that the Volturi's ultimatum has eliminated any possibility that Bella might choose him instead, that her transformation will take her permanently beyond his reach into a world where he cannot follow. The theories about what New Moon revealed about the nature of love explore how the story demonstrates both the beauty and the danger of obsessive attachment, the way love can drive people to self-destructive extremes, the way loss can hollow out a person until they are merely going through the motions of existence. The supernatural bond between Bella and Edward proves stronger than separation, stronger than time, stronger than Edward's determined attempt to sever it, suggesting that some connections transcend conscious choice and physical proximity. that souls recognize each other across any distance and cannot be truly divided by any force except death itself. The exploration of depression and survival through darkness that New Moon provides gives the story weight beyond its supernatural elements, making it a meditation on grief and resilience, on finding reasons to continue when everything that gave life meaning has been stripped away. Bella's journey through the catatonic months and her eventual emergence, scarred but surviving, speaks to the human capacity for endurance, the way we continue even when we cannot imagine why we continue, the stubborn persistence of life even in the face of overwhelming emotional devastation. The theories about identity and transformation that run through New Moon ask profound questions about what we lose and what we gain when we change, about whether Bella's desperate desire to become a vampire represents authentic self-actualization or self-destruction driven by trauma and obsession. The promise that New Moon makes, that dawn always follows even the darkest night, that hope persists even when it seems impossible, that love survives separation and finds its way back across any distance, offers comfort to those who have walked through their own periods of darkness and emerged on the other side transformed but still themselves. As you drift towards sleep, let these theories wash over you like waves, each one offering a different perspective on the same story, each one revealing new layers of meaning in events you thought you understood. New Moon is not just a story about vampires and werewolves, but about the very human experience of loss and recovery, about the ways we destroy ourselves and rebuild ourselves, about the bonds that define us and the choices that transform us. Rest now in the knowledge that every darkness eventually gives way to light, that every loss contains within it the seed of new beginning, that love, however painful, is always worth the risk of grief, because the alternative is never having loved at all.